Welcome to the first edition of Critical Rethinker. My name is Anton, and in the spirit of everything that's been going on these past couple weeks, I just want to jump right into this, so let's go. For me, I don't have any online presence or any notoriety, nothing like that. I mean, at least as far as you know of anyways. But in light of everything that's been happening this past week, I've been thinking very deeply about these events with George Floyd's brutal murder and the subsequent protests and response that are now global. I've also been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and its impact within the context that we're living in now, which right now we're still very much in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and quarantine and the economic shutdown that has had such a negative impact on the poor and working class, myself included. As absolutely pivotal that George Floyd's death has now become, really what more could be added to this conversation about this event in American history that hasn't already been said by a lot of other voices. This event has really forced me to reflect on my own convictions and morals and my beliefs. And so digesting all of this from my perspective of something along the lines of post-evangelical, I guess you can say, that might be the closest description I can think of at the moment. I've been contextualizing how Jesus would respond to this in my head. And I know, cue the kitschy, what would Jesus do nonsense, I know. But really, I believe it's worth discussing and is highly relevant to someone who would consider themselves to be a quote-unquote Christian, even in the loosest sense of the term, or anyone who just thinks that Jesus was a pretty enlightened guy. And so, with that said, in order to fully grasp the impact of George Floyd's murder, we have to consider the entire context surrounding the event. And by that I mean the historical, the socioeconomic, the political background, all of that. We have to consider the history of countless murders of unarmed Black people and the multiple protests for justice on their behalf that all led to this point. Additionally, we have the global negative economic impact of COVID-19 on the low-income population, as I mentioned before, and specifically on African Americans who are statistically more vulnerable to the virus, due in part because of lack of access to quality medical care. And even broader, we have the greater context of Floyd's murder within a horribly failed American capitalist infrastructure that has effectively commodified human life, valuing profit and property over the sanctity of human life. And I don't even want to start on the irony of those who consider themselves pro-life in this situation. The video of George Floyd's brutal death served as an insult to injury in an already immensely suffering community. The history of wrongful murders of African Americans by racist cops has traumatized the Black community to the point where we have essentially an entire community experiencing PTSD symptoms whenever a Black person encounters a cop. It was only a matter of time until this suppressed anger and frustration and fear couldn't be suppressed any longer. So first I want to direct attention to Cornel West, who continues in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he gives a beautifully accurate analysis of the fallout of the capitalist system in response to Floyd's death.
But you know what's sad about it though, brother? At the deepest level, it looks as if the system cannot reform itself. We've tried black faces in high places Too often our black politicians, professional class, middle class, become too accommodated to the capitalist economy, too accommodated to the militarized nation state, too accommodated to the market-driven culture tied with celebrity status, power, fame, all of that superficial stuff that means so much to so many fellow citizens. And what happens? What happens is we got a neo-fascist gangster in the White House who really doesn't care for the most part. You got a neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party that is now in the driver's seat with the collapse of Brother Bernie. And they don't really know what to do because all they want is show more black faces, show more black faces. But oftentimes these black faces are losing legitimacy too, because the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under a black president, black attorney general, and black Homeland Security, and they couldn't deliver, you see? So that when you talk about the masses of black people, the precious poor and working class black people, poor and working class brown, red, yellow, whatever color, they're the ones who are left out and they feel so thoroughly powerless, helpless, hopeless, then you get rebellion. And we've reached the point now, it's a choice between nonviolent revolution. And by revolution, what I mean is the democratic sharing of power, resources, wealth, and respect. If we don't get that kind of sharing, you're going to get more violent explosions.
I just want to add how powerful of a speaker Cornel West is. Beautifully put. What he's telling us is that if you keep the boot on the necks of the poor and marginalized, and I say that figuratively and literally, it's only a matter of time before we've had enough. And from there, it's either you respond meaningfully to the peaceful protests, like the peaceful protests of kneeling during the anthem. Those were pretty peaceful, but yet those were criticized to hell. Either that or you suffer the wrath of violent outbursts. And so in that clip, what really stood out to me in West's description of those within the black community, along with all the other marginalized peoples, was his use of the word precious. And it is that word that really had me connecting this event, these protests, these murders, these marginalized groups. It helped me make that connection to the message of Jesus in a concrete way. So if you go into the Bible, you turn to Luke chapter 4, and in there it recounts Jesus returning to his hometown of Nazareth to teach at a synagogue, and he reads from the Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 61, which in that section also contains a reference back to Isaiah 58, a couple chapters before, with its reference to setting the oppressed free. Here's what it says. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and the regaining of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, when Jesus said that, that was a controversial position for him to have in his own time. You see in the following verses that his listeners were so offended that they drove him out of the town. But my focus here is that this is one of the clearest pictures of those for whom Jesus came for, and that's the poor and marginalized. It's these people that Jesus finds precious in his eyes. Jesus declares himself primarily as the Savior for the poor and marginalized people groups. So there's no denying that the African American community has largely been marginalized throughout U.S. history. And it's been long overdue that we as a nation directly confront this systemic racism that this country's infrastructure is based on and aim to reform it in a meaningful way. Either reform or overthrow it completely. And what really pisses me off in the midst of this discussion is that we have these talking points that conservative evangelicals bring about. And one argument that went viral in some Christian circles was of Benjamin Watson, this dude who appeared on CNN. And on his time on CNN, he downplayed the issue of racism, and he went on to tout that it was in fact at the point of one's sinful nature where change needs to be made. And, you know, you kind of have this facepalm moment, which is so utterly stupid. I mean, obviously, racism is a sin. But even worse, my fear is that the impression that his words leave is that people should be focusing on healing the sinful human nature by essentially having Jesus as their quote-unquote personal Lord and Savior, and not on actively fighting against the systemic racism that exists at the core of America towards effectual change in this current dehumanizing capitalist system. A system that, I'll remind you, disproportionately negatively affects people of color, and more specifically, African Americans. So what I mean to say is, he takes the focus off the concrete issue of racism. Yes, that is a sin. He takes the focus off the concrete issue and diverts it to the broader issue of sin. And it becomes so abstract that you effectively do nothing. And this is irresponsible. The response to an unarmed black man being murdered in cold blood on video by police is not to go out and preach lofty platitudes of how you need to pray to Jesus and let him into your heart. That doesn't mean anything. And what this really is virtue signaling to get mindless evangelicals to agree with you using buzzwords like sin, the gospel, Jesus, salvation. Those are all buzzwords that are used within this context that are empty of meaning. And with that, they try to score these partisan points by owning the libs and all this bullshit. But you know what? In Isaiah, we read of Yahweh's response to injustice. He says, justice is driven back. Godliness stands far off. Indeed, honesty stumbles in the city square, and morality is not even able to enter. Honesty has disappeared. The one who tries to avoid evil is robbed. The Lord watches and is displeased, for there is no justice. The Lord intervenes. He sees that there is no advocate. He is shocked that no one intervenes. So he takes matters into his own hands. His desire for justice drives him on. So make no mistake, the black community is suffering injustice at the hands of the American empire through the economic system, and in this case specifically a militarized police force that exercises excessive brutal force and is almost completely left unaccountable. And God is shocked that no one intervenes. And on top of that, what the establishment is trying to do, and by establishment I mean the political establishment, what they're trying to do is delegitimize the message of these global protests by conflating protesters, peaceful protesters, with looters and those inciting riots. And really, this discussion, this could be a separate discussion, but really, this should not even be on the table. If you cannot discern between a peaceful protester and those who are looting and inciting riots, then I have to question your critical thinking skills or observational skills at that. Because as with any large group of people, there will inevitably be a small percentage of bad faith actors who will use this as an opportunity to loot, create havoc, but it doesn't represent, in this case, the message of the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously. Again, the focus in the media has been shifted away from the core issues of systemic racism and police brutality, now onto the issue of looters and rioters. So now we can't even have a meaningful discussion in the public square because it's being drowned out by these stupid analysis of those who are looting and those who are causing riots. It's ridiculous. But we can't afford to lose focus on these serious problems. Systemic racism and police brutality are the same issues Martin Luther King spoke out against during the Civil Rights Movement. And many will remember in his famous I Have a Dream speech where he says this.
There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied.
So over half a century later, the African community still faces these same injustices. Not enough progress has been made. Now is the time to directly fight against the racist system of policing. Jesus didn't say to sit idly by when you come across those who are marginalized. He gives the example himself. He reached out to them. He welcomed them. He loved them. He provided for their needs, both physical and spiritual. You'll read about it in his encounter with the woman at the well, the tax collectors whom he had a meal with. And you'll remember the religious elites were offended by that. But in reality, now's not the time to simply pray for change and pray for our leaders. If you're not doing anything, it's worthless. Even James says that. James urges for action on behalf of the Christian when he says that faith without works is dead. And my message for those who claim to be Christian is this. Get up off your ass and fight on behalf of the least of these. Be an ally like the many examples that have been shared across all platforms of social media. The images, the videos, they're powerful. Do something to help in a tangible, meaningful way. So don't hide behind posting lofty, eloquent platitudes that sound nice because they ultimately mean nothing if it's not backed up by action. Listen to the cries of the oppressed. Give or be a voice to the voiceless. Offer all of the support you can according to your means. I also want to direct attention to Campaign Zero. Visit their website, campaignzero.org, and you'll see specific legislation laid out that they are pushing for as solutions to combat police brutality, and see how you can help there. They have their policy solutions broken up into 10 categories, so you can take a look at that and research to your heart's content. And again, help where you can. Fight against these oppressors. Fight against oppression. Fight against injustice. If you really care about the freedoms that we have in this country, fight for the justice that pleases God. Promote justice and love faithfulness. And if you're still questioning which side to be on in this fight to radically transform and rebuild our police department systems, if you're thinking that, oh, there's only a few bad eggs, but overall the system is effective and it's been such an institutional staple of American tradition and culture, well, you need to understand that this entire police system, from their training to patrolling, is largely based on racism dating back to its inception, where police were created to round up runaway slaves for slave owners. And it's this system that still, to this day, operates on racial biases and produces racist cops with little to no accountability. There's no middle ground. Radical change in this system must take place immediately before more innocent lives are brutally taken. Oh, and if you're a professing Christian, it's also critical to remember this. Jesus was murdered by the oppressive governmental institution because of pressure from the religious elites. So let that sink in. Thanks for listening.